The telegram slipped from Catherine Sullivan's trembling fingers as the rain began to fall, washing away the ink but not the words that had shattered her world. Cannot marry. Do not follow. Standing barefoot on the dusty platform of Willow Creek Station, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a 6-month-old baby girl sleeping against her chest, Catherine felt the last remnants of her hope dissolve into the gathering storm of 1876. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered as she stared down at little Lucy, swaddled in a thin blanket that offered little protection from the unseasonably cold May evening. How could Thomas abandon them like this? After all his promises of marriage and a new life together in Colorado territory, he had simply disappeared. The station master had shaken his head when she'd asked about the next train back east, informing her that her ticket had been one way and the next eastbound train wouldn't arrive until Tuesday, 3 days away. Miss, you all right there? Catherine looked up, blinking rain from her eyes. A tall figure on horseback loomed before her, silhouetted against the darkening sky. She clutched Lucy tighter to her chest, taking an instinctive step backward. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the wooden platform. Even in the fading light, she could see he was dusty from the trail, with several days' worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. His eyes, however, held no threat, only concern as they flickered from her face to her bare feet and the baby in her arms. Without a word, he shrugged off his long duster coat and draped it gently around her shoulders. The warmth of it still carrying the heat of his body made her realize how cold she'd become. "Name's Mason Garrett," he said, his voice as gentle as his weathered face was hard. "And no lady with a baby ought to be standing barefoot in the rain with nowhere to go." He tipped his hat slightly. "Begging your pardon for being forward, but I've got a room at the boarding house in town. It's yours if you need it. I can bunk with the horses." Catherine clutched the edges of the coat together with one hand, pride and desperation warring within her. "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he said, not unkindly. "This little one doesn't deserve to catch her death because her mama's too proud to accept help when she needs it." The first rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, making her decision for her. "Catherine Sullivan," she said quietly. "And this is Lucy." Mason Garrett nodded once, then reached for the small carpet bag at her feet, all she had left in the world. "Come on, Miss Sullivan. Let's get you both somewhere warm." Little did Catherine know that this act of kindness from a stranger would change the course of her life forever, setting her on a path that would lead through hardship and heartbreak to a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. The town of Willow Creek was little more than a main street with a handful of establishments lining either side. Mason helped Catherine onto his horse, handling her with the same gentle care he might show a skittish colt, before leading them down the muddy street toward a 2-story clapboard building with a sign reading, "Peterson's Boarding House." "Mrs. Peterson's a good woman," Mason explained as they approached. "Bit nosy, but she'll not turn away a woman with a child, especially in this weather." Catherine remained silent, too exhausted and overwhelmed to respond. The baby stirred against her chest, making small fussing noises that suggested she would soon be hungry. Catherine had nothing to feed her, nothing to change her into nothing at all except the clothes on her back and the meager contents of her carpet bag. The boarding house was warm and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. A plump, gray-haired woman looked up from behind a small desk as they entered, her eyebrows rising at the sight of Catherine's bedraggled appearance. "Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion. "I didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Change of plans, Mrs. Peterson," Mason replied, removing his hat. "This here is Miss Sullivan and her daughter. They need a room, and I'd be obliged if you could see to it." Mrs. Peterson's gaze softened as she took in Catherine's bare feet beneath the hem of her mud-splattered dress. "Of course. The poor dear looks half-frozen." She bustled around the desk. "Come with me, honey. I've got a room with a good stove that'll warm you right up. Mason cleared his throat. Put it on my account, Mrs. Peterson. Catherine opened her mouth to protest, but he silenced her with a gentle shake of his head. You can pay me back when you're on your feet again. For now, just get some rest. Mrs. Peterson led Catherine up a narrow staircase to a small but clean room with a bed, a washstand, and a small iron stove already radiating heat. Bathrooms down the hall. I'll bring up some hot water and something for you and the little one to eat. She patted Catherine's arm. Don't you worry about a thing tonight. When the door closed behind her, Catherine sank onto the edge of the bed, still wrapped in Mason's coat. Lucy began to cry in earnest now, hungry and uncomfortable in her damp clothes. Catherine opened her carpet bag with trembling hands, praying that the spare diapers and the last of Lucy's formula had survived the journey. Later, after both she and Lucy had been fed, bathed, and changed into the only clean clothes Catherine possessed, she sat on the edge of the bed, watching her daughter sleep. The events of the day crashed over her like waves, and she buried her face in her hands, allowing herself to weep for the first time since receiving Thomas's telegram. A soft knock at the door startled her. Wiping hastily at her tears, she crossed the room and opened it to find Mason standing in the hallway, a small bundle in his arms. Thought you might need these, he said, handing her the package. Inside were several items, a pair of women's boots, 2 simple dresses, some baby clothes, and other necessities. Mr. Garrett, I can't accept. They belong to my sister, he interrupted, his voice soft but firm. She passed last winter. Consumption. These things were just gathering dust. He shifted uncomfortably. The boots might be a bit big, but they're better than nothing. Catherine clutched the bundle to her chest, overwhelmed by this stranger's kindness. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of old pain, quickly masked. No need for that. Just get some rest. We can talk tomorrow about getting you home. As he turned to leave, Catherine blurted out, I don't have a home to go back to. Mason paused, his broad shoulders tensing beneath his shirt. Without turning around, he nodded once. Then we'll figure something else out. With that, he continued down the hallway, leaving Catherine staring after him, wondering what twist of fate had brought this quiet, kind man into her life at the very moment she needed him most. Morning brought clearer skies and a moment of disorientation as Catherine awoke in the unfamiliar room. Lucy was already awake, cooing softly to herself in the makeshift bed Catherine had fashioned from a drawer padded with blankets. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and with them, a crushing sense of uncertainty. She dressed quickly in one of the dresses Mason had given her, a simple blue calico that was a bit loose but clean and whole. The boots were indeed large, but with an extra pair of stockings, they would suffice. After tending to Lucy's needs, she made her way downstairs, finding Mrs. Peterson in the small dining room, setting places for breakfast. There you are, dear, the older woman said warmly. Sleep well? Yes, thank you, Catherine replied, adjusting Lucy on her hip. Is Mr. Garrett around? I'd like to thank him properly. He rode out at first light, Mrs. Peterson said, placing a stack of flapjacks on the table. Said he had business at his ranch, but he'd be back by midday. She gestured for Catherine to sit. Now eat up. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. As Catherine ate, Mrs. Peterson bustled about, occasionally stopping to coo at Lucy or refill Catherine's coffee cup. Finally, the older woman sat down across from her, her kind face turning serious. Now, I don't mean to pry, but Mason told me a bit about your situation. Left at the station, were you? Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice. Mrs. Peterson clicked her tongue disapprovingly. Some men aren't worth the ground they walk on. If you don't mind my asking, what were your plans? Catherine stared into her coffee cup. I was supposed to marry Lucy's father. He sent for us, said he had a good job at a mine in Colorado, and wanted us to be a family. Her voice caught, but when we arrived, there was only the telegram. He'd changed his mind. And you've nowhere to go back to? Catherine shook her head. My parents disowned me when they found out I was expecting. I've been working as a seamstress in St. Louis, but I spent everything I had on the train tickets. She looked up, meeting the older woman's gaze. I'm a hard worker, Mrs. Peterson. I can sew, cook, clean, anything. I just need a chance. Mrs. Peterson reached across the table to pat her hand. Well, as it happens, this town could use a good seamstress. Our last one moved to Denver last year, and the ladies here have been making do with mail orders or traveling all the way to Silverton. She smiled. Why don't you stay on here for a while? I could use help with the borders, and you could set up your sewing in the front parlor. Hope flickered in Catherine's chest for the first time since reading Thomas's telegram. You do that for me? A complete stranger? Mason Garrett doesn't vouch for just anyone, Mrs. Peterson said, rising to clear the dishes. And I've always believed the good Lord puts people in our path for a reason. By the time Mason returned that afternoon, Catherine had already helped Mrs. Peterson prepare lunch for the boarders, changed all the linens in the vacant rooms, and was sitting in the front parlor, mending a tear in one of the tablecloths with tiny, precise stitches. He paused in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling it. Without his duster and hat, she could see him properly for the first time. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and the weathered complexion of a man who spent most of his days outdoors. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. Miss Sullivan, he said, nodding. You're looking better today. Catherine set aside her sewing and stood. Thanks to you, Mr. Garrett. I don't know what would have become of us if you hadn't come along. He looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Any decent man would have done the same. Perhaps, she said softly, but it was you who did. A hint of color touched his cheekbones above his beard. Mrs. Peterson tells me you're planning to stay on for a while. If that's all right. She's offered me work, and I thought it's a good idea, he interrupted. Willow Creek's a decent town. Small but growing. People look out for each other here. He hesitated, then added, I came to let you know that I've sent word to the sheriff about your situation. In case that fella who left you stranded decides to show his face. Catherine felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. She hadn't considered that Thomas might come back. Do you think he would? Mason's expression hardened. Men like that are cowards, but cowards can be unpredictable. Better to have the law aware, just in case. She nodded, grateful for his foresight. Thank you. Again. He cleared his throat. I've got a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town. If you need anything at all, you send word. He turned to leave, then stopped. Almost forgot. Got something for the little one. From his pocket, he produced a small wooden carving of a horse, sanded smooth and polished to a soft gleam. Oh, Catherine breathed, taking the little toy. It's beautiful. Made it last night, he said, looking almost embarrassed. Figured she might like something to play with when she gets a bit older. Before Catherine could respond, Lucy, who had been napping in a basket nearby, woke with a hungry cry. Mason took a step back, as if suddenly remembering his place. I'll leave you to it, he said, backing toward the door. Good day, Miss Sullivan. Catherine, she called after him impulsively. Please call me Catherine. He paused, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Catherine, then. With a nod, he was gone, leaving her to wonder about the quiet rancher who carved toys for babies in the night and offered help without expecting anything in return. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern. Catherine worked alongside Mrs. Peterson during the day, cleaning rooms and helping in the kitchen, while also taking in mending and sewing projects from the townspeople. Word spread quickly that a skilled seamstress had arrived in Willow Creek, and soon she had enough work to justify setting up a small sewing area in the corner of the boarding house's front parlor. Mason Garrett was a frequent visitor, though his visits were always brief and seemingly purposeful, bringing supplies from his ranch, fixing things around the boarding house, or checking in with Sheriff Davis, who also took his meals at Peterson's. Yet Catherine noticed that his visits often coincided with the times when she would be in the front parlor with Lucy, sewing while the baby played on a blanket nearby. He never stayed long, and he rarely said much, but he always had a small gift for Lucy: a carved animal, a colorful stone, or once, a tiny rag doll that he admitted, with some embarrassment, had been made by his ranch hand's wife after hearing about the little one at Peterson's. On a warm June afternoon, nearly a month after her arrival in Willow Creek, Catherine was sitting on the boarding house's front porch, enjoying a rare moment of rest while Lucy napped inside under Mrs. Peterson's watchful eye. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the street, where Mason was dismounting from his horse. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat as he approached. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Catherine replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Please join me." He hesitated, then sat, placing his hat on his knee. "Where's Lucy?"
"Napping."
"Mrs. Peterson insisted on watching her, so I could have a few minutes to myself." She smiled. "That woman is a godsend." "That she is," Mason agreed. He seemed unusually tense, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the brim of his hat. "I heard from Sheriff Davis this morning. He's been making inquiries about your situation." Catherine's smile faded. "Has something happened?" "Nothing bad," Mason assured her quickly. "Just thought you should know that they found that fella Thomas, was it? He's working at a mine near Silverton, just like he told you. Seems he got himself married to the mine owner's daughter 3 weeks before you arrived." The news should have hurt more than it did, Catherine reflected. Perhaps she had already accepted Thomas's betrayal, or perhaps the weeks of hard work and building a new life had begun to heal the wound. "I see," she said softly. "Well, at least now I know." Mason studied her face. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. "I think I am. Thomas and our relationship was brief. He was charming, and I was young and naive." She looked down at her hands, remembering the terror and desperation of those first days after Lucy's birth, alone and abandoned. "By the time I realized I was expecting, he had already left St. Louis. I wrote to him, and months later, he finally responded with the train tickets and promises of marriage." "Some men don't deserve the title," Mason said, his voice hard. "Leaving a woman with child, there's no excuse for that." "No," Catherine agreed. "But in a strange way, I'm grateful. If he hadn't sent for us, I never would have come west. I never would have found Willow Creek." She glanced at him. "I never would have met you." Something flickered in Mason's eyes, a warmth that made her heart beat a little faster. But he looked away quickly, clearing his throat. "Speaking of Willow Creek, that's actually why I came by today. There's a social at the church on Saturday. Thought you and Lucy might like to go. Meet some of the other folks in town." "Are you asking to escort us, Mr. Garrett?" Catherine asked, surprising herself with her boldness. The color that crept up his neck was endearing on such a rugged man. "If that would be acceptable, yes." "We would be honored," she said, smiling. "Although I should warn you, my dancing is rather rusty." "That makes 2 of us," he admitted, a rare smile transforming his serious face. "Haven't danced since my sister's wedding. Must be 7, 8 years ago now." The mention of his sister sobered them both. Catherine had learned from Mrs. Peterson that Mason had raised his younger sister after their parents died in a fire, only to lose her to consumption the previous winter. It explained much about his solitary nature and his unexpected kindness toward a woman with a child. "I'm sorry about your sister," Catherine said softly. It was very kind of you to give me her things. Mason nodded, his gaze distant. Elizabeth would have liked you. She was always bringing home strays, puppies, kittens, once even a half-drowned calf. His lips quirked in a sad smile. She had a soft heart. It runs in the family, it seems, Catherine observed gently. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. Don't go thinking I'm some kind of saint, Catherine. I'm just a man who's seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. Before she could respond, the door opened behind them, and Mrs. Peterson appeared with a fussing Lucy in her arms. Someone's awake and hungry, she announced, passing the baby to Catherine. And, if I'm not mistaken, wanting her mama. The moment between them broken. Mason stood and settled his hat on his head. I should be getting back to the ranch. Got a new foal that needs watching. He nodded to Mrs. Peterson, then to Catherine. Saturday, then? Saturday, Catherine confirmed, adjusting Lucy in her arms. She watched him stride down the street to his horse, his tall figure straight and steady, and felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. The church social was a simple affair by Eastern standards, but to Catherine, who had spent the last year shunned by proper society, it was a delight. The town hall had been decorated with wildflowers and paper streamers, and tables laden with food lined one wall. A small group of musicians played lively tunes while couples danced and children ran laughing between the adults. Mason arrived at the boarding house promptly at 6, dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, a clean white shirt under a dark vest, his usual worn jeans replaced by darker, newer ones, and his boots polished to a respectable shine. He had even trimmed his beard, Catherine noticed, and the effect was rather handsome. For her part, Catherine had spent the day altering one of Elizabeth Garrett's dresses, a pretty green calico that complemented her auburn hair. Mrs. Peterson had insisted on watching Lucy for the evening, shooing Catherine out the door with instructions to enjoy herself for once. As they walked to the town hall, Mason offered her his arm, and Catherine took it, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her fingertips. They made an odd pair. She thought the quiet, solitary rancher and the disgraced Easterner with a child born out of wedlock. Yet somehow, in this moment, she felt more at ease than she had in years. You look nice, Mason said suddenly, as if the words had escaped without his permission. Catherine smiled up at him. So do you. Very distinguished. He snorted softly. Don't know about that. But I did try to make myself presentable. You succeeded, she assured him, and was rewarded with that rare, transformative smile that made her heart skip. The social was in full swing when they arrived. Mason led her inside, nodding greetings to the townspeople, many of whom stopped to introduce themselves to Catherine. She was surprised by how many knew her by name. Already news traveled fast in small towns, and even more surprised by their genuine welcome. That's Dorothy Simmons, Mason murmured, nodding toward a plump woman in a lavender dress. Her husband owns the Mercantile. She's been telling everyone how you saved her Sunday dress after she caught it on a nail. It was a simple repair, Catherine demurred, but she was pleased nonetheless. And that's Mayor Wilson and his wife, Mason continued, indicating an older couple near the refreshment table. He's been in office since the town was founded. Good man, fair. As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself drawn into conversations with the women of Willow Creek, who were eager to discuss everything from the latest fashions, which Catherine knew from her work in St. Louis, to the challenges of keeping a garden in the rocky soil of Colorado. Mason drifted in and out of her orbit, sometimes at her side, sometimes across the room talking with the other men, but his eyes frequently sought her out, as if reassuring himself of her presence. When the musician struck up a waltz, Mason appeared at her elbow. "Might I have this dance?" he asked formally, offering his hand. Catherine placed her fingers in his. "I warned you I'm out of practice," she reminded him as he led her to the dance floor. "And I warned you the same," he replied, his voice low. "We'll muddle through together." His hand was warm and steady at her waist as he guided her into the dance. For all his claims of rustiness, Mason moved with a natural grace that belied his size, and Catherine found herself relaxing into his lead. They weren't the most polished couple on the floor, but there was something right about the way they moved together, something that felt like a conversation without words. "You're staring, Mr. Garrett," Catherine said softly after catching his gaze on her face for the third time. "Mason," he corrected. "And yes, I suppose I am. May I ask why?" He was silent for a moment, guiding her through a turn before answering. "Because I'm trying to figure you out, Catherine Sullivan." "There's not much to figure out," she said lightly. "What you see is what you get." His blue eyes were serious as they met hers. "What I see is a woman who's been hurt badly, but hasn't let it break her. A mother who'd do anything for her child. A lady with more courage than most men I know." His voice dropped lower. "And yes, a very beautiful woman who doesn't seem to know it." Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks, and it had nothing to do with the warmth of the crowded room. "You give me too much credit." "I don't think I give you enough," he countered. His hand tightened slightly at her waist, drawing her a fraction closer as they moved to the music. "I've known a lot of people who've faced hardship, Catherine. Most either break under it or grow hard. You've done neither." The intensity in his gaze was almost too much to bear. Catherine looked away, focusing on the steady rhythm of their steps. "Perhaps I just haven't had time to do either yet." "No," he said with quiet certainty. "That's not it. It's who you are." The music was drawing to a close, and he slowed their movements, his hand still warm at her waist. "And who you are is remarkable." Before Catherine could respond, the final notes of the waltz faded, and the dancers around them broke into applause. Mason stepped back, releasing her, and the moment whatever it had been passed. But something had shifted between them, something significant that neither was quite ready to name. As the evening wound down, Mason escorted Catherine back to the boarding house, their conversation easy, but charged with a new awareness. At the front door, he removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight," Catherine said, breaking the momentary silence. "It was my pleasure," he replied, his voice low in the darkness. "Truly." They stood there, the space between them seeming both vast and infinitesimal. Finally, Mason cleared his throat. "I should let you get inside. It's getting late." "Yes," Catherine agreed, though she made no move to open the door. Mason took a step closer, then stopped, as if catching himself. "Good night, Catherine," he said softly, and before she could respond, he bent and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek so brief she might have imagined it. Then he was gone, striding down the street toward the livery where he'd left his horse, leaving Catherine standing on the porch with her fingertips pressed to her cheek and her heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with the dances they'd shared. Summer passed in a haze of work and stolen moments. Catherine's sewing business flourished as word of her skills spread throughout the county. She saved every penny, determined to build a secure future for herself and Lucy. Mason became a regular visitor at the boarding house, bringing fresh vegetables from his garden or toys for Lucy, who had begun to toddle about on uncertain legs. The change in their relationship was subtle but unmistakable. A lingering touch when passing the salted dinner. Shared glances across Mrs. Peterson's parlor. The way Mason's gruff demeanor softened whenever Lucy reached for him with her chubby hands, demanding to be lifted. They never spoke of the night of the social, of that brief kiss or the words exchanged during their dance, but it hung between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. In late August, Mason appeared at the boarding house with an unusual request. "I was wondering if you might like to visit the ranch tomorrow," he said, his hat in his hands as always when indoors. "Sunday dinner, maybe? I thought Lucy might enjoy seeing the horses." Catherine looked up from the shirt she was mending. "That sounds lovely. Are you sure we won't be imposing?" Not at all, he assured her. My cook, Rosa, has been pestering me to bring you out. Says she wants to meet the lady who's put some color back in the boss's cheeks. He looked slightly embarrassed at this admission. Catherine smiled, charmed by his discomfort. Then we would be delighted to accept. The Garrett Ranch was modest by Colorado standards, a neat clapboard house surrounded by several outbuildings, a corral full of horses, and grazing land that stretched toward the mountains. Mason met them as the buggy he'd sent pulled up to the house, lifting Lucy into his arms with practiced ease before helping Catherine down. It's not much, he said, suddenly self-conscious as he looked at his home through her eyes. But it's mine, free and clear. It's wonderful, Catherine said sincerely, taking in the carefully tended garden and the solid craftsmanship of the house. How long have you been here? Coming up on 10 years now, Mason replied, leading her toward the house with Lucy babbling happily in his arms. Came west with Elizabeth after our parents died. Started with just 50 acres and a dream. His expression softened with pride. Now it's 300 acres, 30 head of cattle, and some of the finest horses this side of the Rockies. The inside of the house was simply but comfortably furnished, with polished wooden floors and large windows that filled the rooms with light. A small, round woman with graying black hair tied in a neat bun emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. So this is the famous Miss Sullivan and little Lucy, she said, her dark eyes twinkling. I am Rosa Diaz. My husband Miguel and I work for Senor Garrett. She eyed Catherine appraisingly. He did not exaggerate your beauty, senorita. Rosa, Mason warned, but there was no heat in it. Rosa merely laughed, reaching for Lucy. Come, little one. Let Rosa show you the cookies while your mama and the boss talk. To Catherine's surprise, Lucy went willingly into the woman's arms, apparently won over by the mention of cookies. Rosa and Miguel have been with me since I started the ranch, Mason explained as they watched the older woman carry Lucy into the kitchen, murmuring to her in a mix of English and Spanish. They're family more than employees. Dinner was served in the airy dining room, with windows overlooking the corrals where several horses grazed peacefully. Rosa had outdone herself with a feast of roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, and warm bread that filled the house with its homey scent. Lucy, perched on Mason's lap, he had insisted when she'd reached for him, smeared mashed potatoes across her face with gleeful abandon while the adults talked. After the meal, Mason suggested a walk to see the new foals. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the land as they strolled toward the corral, Lucy running ahead on her sturdy little legs, occasionally stopping to examine a fascinating rock or wildflower. She's growing so fast, Mason observed, watching as Lucy squatted to inspect a particularly interesting pebble. Too fast, Catherine agreed. Sometimes I look at her and can hardly believe she's the same tiny baby who arrived in Willow Creek. Mason glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. You've both come a long way since that night at the station. Thanks to you, Catherine said softly. He shook his head. No. I may have offered a coat and a room, but everything since then has been your doing, Catherine. Your strength, your determination. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Do you know what I thought when I first saw you standing there in the rain? Catherine shook her head, suddenly unable to find her voice. I thought, there's a woman who deserves better than what life's handed her. His voice was low, almost rough with emotion. And every day since, you've proven me right. Before Catherine could respond, Lucy let out a delighted squeal as they reached the corral. A beautiful Palomino mare approached the fence, her golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. Behind her, a gangly foal with the same golden coloring peered curiously at the visitors. That's Sunny, Mason said, lifting Lucy so she could see better. And her little one, born just this spring. She's beautiful, Catherine breathed, reaching out to stroke the mare's velvety nose. They both are. She's yours if you want her, Mason said quietly. Catherine turned to him in surprise. What? The foal, he clarified. I'd like to give her to Lucy. For when she's older, of course. But she'd be raised here, trained gentle, waiting for when the time is right. Catherine stared at him, this man who seemed to give and give without expectation of return. Mason, that's far too generous. I couldn't possibly. You could, he interrupted, setting Lucy down to let her toddle along the fence line under his watchful eye. And you would, if you understood what I'm really asking. Catherine's heart began to beat faster as she met his steady gaze. And what is that? Mason took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. I'm asking if you might consider a future here. For both of you. He gestured toward the house, the corrals, the land beyond. This place. It's been just a ranch since Elizabeth died. But with you and Lucy here, it could be a home again. Mason, Catherine whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I know it's sudden, he continued, the words coming faster now. And I know you've had your trust broken before. I'm not asking for an answer today. Just think about it. About us. Catherine looked at him, this quiet, honorable man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect from the moment they met, who had seen her at her lowest and offered help without judgment, who carved toys for her daughter and danced with her as if she were the only woman in the room. I don't need to think about it, she said softly. Mason's face fell slightly. I understand. It was presumptuous of me. No, Catherine interrupted, stepping closer to him. I meant I don't need to think about it, because I already know my answer. She reached up, placing her palm against his weathered cheek. Yes, Mason. Yes to a future here. Yes to making this a home again. Yes to us. The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Mindful of Lucy playing nearby, Mason captured Catherine's hand and pressed a fervent kiss to her palm. I promise you won't regret it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll spend every day making sure of that. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land, Mason Garrett and Catherine Sullivan stood side by side, watching a little girl chase butterflies in the golden light, the promise of tomorrow stretching before them like the vast Colorado sky. Their courtship progressed with a steady, unhurried pace that characterized Mason himself. He was a man of actions rather than words, proving his devotion through consistent presence and thoughtful gestures. Each Sunday, he brought Catherine and Lucy to the ranch, gradually introducing Catherine to the operations of the place that would one day be her home. He taught her to ride, his strong hands steady on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle, his patience endless as she learned to guide the gentle mare he'd chosen for her. The town of Willow Creek watched their courtship with approving eyes. Mrs. Peterson, who had grown as fond of Catherine and Lucy as if they were her own family, was particularly delighted by the match. Always knew Mason Garrett would make someone a fine husband, she told Catherine one evening as they cleared the dinner dishes. Just needed the right woman to thaw that frozen heart of his. Elizabeth's death hit him hard, he blamed himself, you know. Thought he should have sent her to a sanitarium in Denver, though the doctors all said it wouldn't have made a difference. Catherine had come to understand that Mason carried the weight of responsibility heavily for his sister, for his ranch hands and their families, for the legacy his parents had left him. He was a man accustomed to shouldering burdens alone, and it had taken time for him to accept that Catherine had no intention of being another responsibility, but rather a partner to share both joys and sorrows. In early October, with the aspen trees turning gold against the evergreens, Mason proposed properly. He had taken Catherine to a high meadow on the ranch, where a picnic lunch awaited them. Lucy, now a steady walker with an independent streak that both delighted and exhausted her mother, explored the wildflowers under their watchful eyes. I had a whole speech planned, Mason admitted, taking Catherine's hand as they sat on the blanket. "About how you've brought light back into my life. How seeing you and Lucy at the ranch makes me remember what a home should feel like." He shook his head ruefully. "But now that the moment's here, I find I'm not much good with flowery words." Catherine squeezed his hand encouragingly. "You don't need flowery words with me, Mason." He met her gaze, his blue eyes serious. "Then let me say it plain. I love you, Catherine Sullivan. You and Lucy both. I want to be a husband to you and a father to her if you'll have me." From his pocket, he produced a small box. Inside was a ring not elaborate or ostentatious, but a simple gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds, elegant in its simplicity. "It was my mother's," Mason explained. "One of the few things that survived the fire." Tears filled Catherine's eyes as she looked from the ring to the man before her, this good, honorable man who had rescued her on a rainy night and never stopped caring for her since. "I love you too," she whispered. "And yes, Mason Garrett, I will marry you." The joy that lit his face was like nothing Catherine had ever seen. Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Lucy toddled over, arms full of wildflowers, demanding to be included in whatever was happening. Mason lifted her high, spinning her in a circle that made her shriek with laughter. "What do you say, Miss Lucy? Would you like me to be your papa?" Lucy, too young to understand the question fully, nevertheless patted his bearded cheek with sticky hands. "Ma say," she said firmly, her closest approximation of his name. "I'll take that as a yes," Mason laughed, settling her on his hip and reaching for Catherine's hand. As they walked back toward the ranch house, Catherine felt a sense of rightness, of completion. The road that had led her here had been filled with heartbreak and desperation, but standing now with Mason's hand warm in hers and Lucy babbling happily between them, she wouldn't change a single step of the journey. They were married in the Willow Creek Church on a crisp November morning, with golden leaves swirling outside the windows and the entire town in attendance. Catherine wore a gown of ivory silk that she had sewn herself, with tiny pearl buttons that Lucy had helped choose at the mercantile. Mason, uncomfortable in his formal suit, nonetheless stood tall and proud at the altar, his eyes never leaving Catherine as she walked down the aisle with Lucy in her arms. The ceremony was simple, but deeply meaningful. When it came time for the vows, Mason had surprised her by writing his own, a fact he'd kept secret until that very moment. "Catherine," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes, "when I found you that night at the station, I thought I was offering shelter to a woman in need. I didn't know I was finding the other half of my heart." He took her hand, his larger one engulfing hers. "I promise to be your shelter from every storm, your partner in every joy, and your comfort in every sorrow. I promise to love Lucy as my own flesh and blood, and any other children we might be blessed with. I promise to build a life with you that is as strong and true as the mountains that surround us." There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Mason gently wiped away the tears that had spilled onto Catherine's cheeks. Her own vows, though simpler, were no less heartfelt, promising love, loyalty, and partnership for all the days of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed her with a tenderness that belied his strength, sealing their union as the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. Lucy, perched on Mrs. Peterson's lap in the front pew, clapped her little hands in delight, caught up in the joy of the moment even if she didn't fully comprehend its significance. The celebration afterward at the Garrett Ranch was a testament to the community's affection for both of them. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in town, and the barn had been transformed with lanterns and ribbons for dancing. Catherine found herself passed from dance to dance, congratulated by everyone from the mayor to the youngest ranch hands, all expressing genuine happiness for the new family. As the evening wore on, she found a quiet moment with Mason on the porch of what was now their home. Lucy had fallen asleep hours earlier, worn out by excitement, and tucked safely into the nursery that Mason had prepared for her, complete with a rocking horse he'd carved himself. "Happy, Mrs. Garrett?" Mason asked, his arm warm around her shoulders as they looked out at the stars. "Completely," Catherine replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I'm still getting used to the name." He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "You'll have plenty of time. A lifetime, in fact." Catherine turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had become as dear to her as her own reflection. "Thank you," she said softly. Mason's brow furrowed slightly. "For what?" "For dropping your coat that night. For seeing a woman who needed help, not a burden to be avoided." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "For loving us both when we needed it most." Mason captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I think I began falling in love with you that very night," he admitted. "Standing there in the rain, clutching your baby, with nothing but determination keeping you upright." His arms tightened around her. "You are the strongest, most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." Catherine rose on her tiptoes, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Behind them, the sounds of the celebration continued, music and laughter floating on the night air, but they were lost in each other, in the miracle of having found love in the most unexpected of circumstances. Later, when the last guest had departed and the house was quiet save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth, Catherine stood in the doorway of Lucy's nursery, watching her daughter sleep peacefully. Mason's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "Our daughter," he whispered, and the simple words filled Catherine's heart to overflowing. "Our daughter," she agreed, leaning back against the solid warmth of her husband. "And our home." Mason turned her in his arms, his eyes dark with emotion in the dim light of the hallway. "Our life," he added, before sweeping her into his arms and carrying her toward their bedroom, where the journey they had begun on a rainy night at Willow Creek Station would continue into a future brighter than either could have imagined. Epilogue. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the Garrett Ranch, now expanded to nearly 500 acres of the most prosperous land in the county. From her vantage point on the wide front porch, Catherine watched as Mason led a small, golden-haired figure on a gleaming Palomino pony around the corral. Lucy, now 6 years old and fearless as the day was long, sat straight in the saddle, her face a picture of concentration as she followed her father's instructions. "Heels down, Lucy girl," Mason called, his voice carrying clearly in the summer air. "That's it. You're a natural, just like your mama." Catherine smiled, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their third child grew. Their son, James, not quite 3, played at her feet with the carved wooden animals that had been his sister's before him, occasionally looking up to wave at his father and sister in the corral. The years had been kind to the Garrett family. Mason's careful management had expanded the ranch's operations, and they now supplied horses to stagecoach companies across 3 territories. Catherine's sewing business had evolved into a small but thriving dress shop in town, where she worked 3 days a week while Rosa, now officially Jamie's doting godmother, watched over him. Life wasn't without its challenges. The harsh Colorado winters, the occasional drought, the normal trials of raising young children in a sometimes unforgiving land, all these they faced together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. As Catherine watched, Lucy completed her circuit of the corral, her face splitting into a wide grin of accomplishment. Mason lifted her from the saddle, swinging her high before setting her on her feet and ruffling her blonde curls, so like his own in color, though she had Catherine's green eyes and determined chin. "Manga," Lucy called, racing toward the house with boundless energy. "Did you see? I rode all by myself." I saw, sweetheart, Catherine assured her, holding out her arms as Lucy bounded up the porch steps. You were magnificent. Mason followed at a more sedate pace, pausing to scoop up Jamie, who had abandoned his toys to toddle toward his father. The sight of them, her tall, strong husband with their son on his hip, both of them sun-bronzed and smiling, filled Catherine with a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. "What's this?" Mason asked, noticing the letter in Catherine's lap as he climbed the porch steps. "News from back east." Catherine nodded, picking up the letter from her sister, the only family member who had maintained contact after the scandal of Lucy's birth. "Mary's coming for a visit next month. She's finally convinced her husband that Colorado isn't the end of the earth." Mason settled into the chair beside her, Jamie perched contentedly on his knee. "Will be good for the children to meet their aunt," he observed. "And for you to see your sister." "Yes," Catherine agreed, though a shadow of old pain crossed her face. "Though I doubt my parents will ever make the journey." Mason reached over to take her hand, his thumb rubbing gently over her knuckles. "Their loss," he said simply. "Look what they're missing." He gestured to the scene before them, their beautiful home, the prosperous ranch, their healthy children. Catherine squeezed his hand, grateful as always for his unwavering support. "You know," Mason said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about that night at the station. How different things might have been if I'd decided to stay in town another day, or if you'd taken an earlier train. Or if you hadn't been the kind of man who stops for a woman with no shoes and a baby," Catherine added softly. Mason's blue eyes, still as piercing as the day they met, held hers. "Best decision I ever made, dropping that coat." Lucy, who had been listening with the curiosity of a child hearing a familiar but beloved story, piped up from where she sat on the porch rail. "Tell it again, Papa. About how you found Mama and me at the train station." Mason chuckled, settling back in his chair. "Well, it was a cold, rainy evening in May," he began, his deep voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "I was heading back to the ranch when I saw the most remarkable sight, a beautiful woman standing barefoot in the rain, holding a tiny baby girl close to her heart." "That was me," Lucy interjected proudly. "That was you," Mason confirmed with a smile. "The bravest, smallest little thing I'd ever seen." He continued the tale, embellished slightly for his daughter's benefit, though the essential truth remained the same: two lonely souls finding each other against all odds, building a family and a future from the ruins of broken dreams. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, Catherine looked around at her family: Mason, still handsome and strong; Lucy, growing more confident and capable each day; Jamie, with his father's quiet nature and her own quick smile, and the new life stirring beneath her heart. From the depths of despair on that rainy platform, she had found her way to this moment of perfect contentment. And that, Mason concluded, meeting Catherine's gaze over their children's heads, is how one coat, dropped at just the right moment, changed everything. "Everything," Catherine agreed softly, her hand finding his across the space between them, a gesture as familiar and necessary as breathing. "Absolutely everything." As the golden light of evening bathed the Garrett Ranch in its warm glow, the family remained on the porch, sharing stories and laughter, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the western sky above. And Catherine, once abandoned and alone, knew with unshakable certainty that she was, at last and forever, exactly where she belonged.